There's one area of rainforest in South America that no one so far has tried to cut down. One reason is that its trees stand rooted in several meters of water. The forest is a lost world, filled with animals that rarely show themselves among the trees and unfamiliar plants. From the center, the forest stretches for 800 kilometers in all directions. Through it run large rivers, often hidden by the great trees along their banks. 1,600 kilometers to the east, all these rivers add their waters to the Amazon. There are many strange creatures in this flooded forest, but none so strange as this bird. It's the Hoatzin. At first sight, the Hoatzin looks like a link between the earliest birds and their reptile ancestors. It's a most appropriate denizen of this lost world. In Amazonia, these flooded forests are known as the Igapo. But where in this vast watery wilderness do you start to look for an undisturbed area where the birds nest? One choice is the forests of Ecuador. Ecuador is a small South American country between Colombia and Peru, little larger than Great Britain. But it contains a vast scenic range that includes part of the Andes, 4 great volcanoes, and the Igapo, the green area on the map. The Igapo is laced with great Amazon tributaries. The quest for the Hoatzin began on one of them. Friedemann Koester, scientist turned wildlife cameraman, is a former director of the Charles Darwin Research Station in the Galapagos Islands. He's worked as a scientist for 20 years in South America. So he thought he knew the difficulties when he set out to make a film about the Hoatzin. The Hoatzin isn't an endangered species. It isn't even particularly rare along these rivers. But it is extremely shy and easily disturbed. So to film its breeding behavior, Friedemann had to find a remote location where the bird nested in sufficient numbers. He often caught brief glimpses of a Hoatzin when making his early reconnaissances. The main waterways certainly weren't going to produce the answer. There's a surprising amount of Indian canoe traffic on them. He had to find somewhere hidden deep in the Igapo. So he turned to his friends among the forest Indians for advice. The chief of the Secoya tribe, Victoriano Criollo, was very willing to help, even though the whole enterprise probably seemed crazy to him. Why should anyone want to photograph a bird? Hoatzin aren't even good to eat. Their flesh is rather rank, though their eggs are quite good as a change from monkey and fish. Nevertheless, if that's what his friend Friedemann wanted, he would offer a suggestion. He would even come along as guide with his son. The place the chief suggested was the lagoon of Cuyabeno. Cuyabeno lies close to the Colombian border. It's a nature reserve within the territory of the Secoya Indians, a tribe related to the Secoya. It's seldom that anyone from the outside world goes there. In the center of Cuyabeno there's a lagoon, one of the few open spaces in the flooded forest. It's a basin raised slightly above the level of the rest of the Igapo. When the rivers are in full flow, the lagoon is flooded to a depth of up to 3 meters. When the rivers fall, around January, Cuyabeno can dry out in a few days and flood again nearly as quickly. This was the ideal place, the chief said, to film Hoatzin. Getting there was no problem. at least not to anyone brought up in the flooded forest. Friedemann's wife, Heide, accompanied them on their first trip to Cuiabeno. The chief's son manned the outboard. Nowadays, most Indian fishermen use these motors, another reason for the Koesters to get far away from the main rivers. Hoatzin don't care for the noise of outboards. The chief lent the Koesters one of his huts as their base on the lagoon. To have such a base was perfect. One of the wildlife cameraman's main problems when working in remote places is to have somewhere to store equipment and film, and to catch up on vital paperwork. At Cuiabeno, at least that part was going to be easy. Almost nothing else was. The first problem was to provide the cameras with a steady base. Practically all the filming would have to be done while afloat. A partial answer was to lash two canoes together and build a platform over the stern of both. Would Cuiabeno fulfill its promise, not only for filming Hoatzin, but also the secret life of the forest about which so little is known? Friedemann had previously only flown at low level over the lagoon. This was the first time he had seen it at ground, or rather water level.
When I got to this beautiful lagoon for the first time, I was amazed. The dark forest opened all of a sudden and gave way to this vast lake. All the trees stood half submerged and reflected in the water. It was absolutely calm and peaceful. From the forest edge, distant bird calls were ringing over the lagoon. I thought I had never been to a place more enchanting than this.
In this Garden of Eden there are many serpents. The first one they came across was a tree snake 1.5 meters long. Life surrounded by water is no problem for a tree snake. They're excellent swimmers, so they can move from tree to tree to hunt small birds, tree frogs and lizards. This is a leaf-footed bug, camouflaged against predators by mimicking a plant. It's hard to see where evolution produced many of these life forms. Presumably the long horn-like appendages of this spider have some function. While Friedemann filmed these weird life forms, he saw Hoatzin every day. He knew he'd found the right location, but the nesting season was nearly over. He'd have to wait months till they nested again. Time to film the other curious life of the flooded forest. Two sorts of animals live in Cuiabeno. Those who must stay put when the floods come and find a living where they are, and those who can move around in search of food and shelter. For at least 10 months of the year, the ants have to make do with what a single tree provides. The ants have solved their food problem in an ingenious way. Their tree of residence flourishes in flood conditions. The sap is full of sugary substances. The ants don't eat the sap themselves, but the tree hopper does. Tree hoppers excrete a sugary honeydew. The ants tend and milk the tree hoppers, so everyone, except the tree, gets something out of the relationship. If life forms are bizarre here, then so are some forms of death. Fungus spores have invaded the body of a butterfly, mummifying it where it died on the leaf. One insect, a small brown moth related to the tiger moths, has dealt with the difficulties of living out its life cycle surrounded by water. From its earliest stages, its caterpillar lives in the water. It has an ingenious method of breathing. When on the surface, the hairs on its back are raised and wide apart. When it wants to breathe below the surface, it shuts those hairs to form a tube. This traps bubbles of air which it takes down with it. The caterpillar finds its food among the waterweed and algae of the lagoon. When Friedemann Koester questioned the forest Indians about this, they said they knew the caterpillar but had no idea what it turned into. They did know a small brown moth, which they said came to bathe with them in the evenings. Friedemann filled in the gap in their knowledge. The moth they saw was laying its eggs at the surface. Those eggs hatch to produce this caterpillar. The large creatures of Quillabeno, especially the mammals, must be able to cross stretches of water so that they can travel from tree to find food. One of the sloth's food trees is the macrolobium. It doesn't grow in clumps. There are few clumps of anything in the lagoon. So if the sloth isn't to starve, it has to swim. Swimming is something it does extremely slowly, but then a sloth does everything extremely slowly. This is a three-toed sloth. The dark patch on its back shows that it's a male. The next macrolobium tree is reached at last. One could run out of film waiting for the sloth to complete a simple action like climbing a tree, but this very slowness is one of its best defenses. Predators, and the sloth's predators include harpy eagles, watch for movement. The sloth doesn't provide them with much of that. The sloth's movements are far too leisurely to disturb an Amazon kingfisher on the lookout for tiddlers on a nearby tree. Once in the treetops, the sloth's favorite posture is to hang upside down beneath a branch. The hooked claws give it an almost unbreakable hold. This harmless vegetarian has a face that might have been invented by a science fiction writer, conjuring up a humanoid from outer space. For 10 months of the year, Quillabeno looks like this. Then in January, there's a dramatic change. There's far less rain. The rivers fall, the water drains out of the lagoon, and Quillabeno presents an entirely different picture. Land that was under 3 meters of water is suddenly exposed. Within 2 days, green patches begin to appear. 3 weeks ago, Friedemann Koester canoed past these trees. The water was then 3/4 of the way up their trunks. 3 days ago, the bed of the lagoon was bare mud. In that short time, grass has grown 5 centimeters high. The vegetation has to respond quickly to the short, dry season if it is to flower and set seed before the waters return. Almost overnight, the wildlife of Quillabeno finds itself living in a highly modified habitat. And not only the resident wildlife of the lagoon. Animals from the surrounding forest take advantage of Quillabeno's sudden greening. These parrots are forest birds. The forest is so dark that grass doesn't grow there. This is the only time birds like this sapphire-rumped parrotlet have a chance to eat succulent grass shoots, and they take full advantage of it. Seeds must germinate and push up a shoot before the floods return. Provided the young trees can grow 1/2 meter or so and put out a few leaves, they've got a chance. Some succeed, and here's the proof. Mature trees that have stood waist-deep in the lagoon for many seasons. The long tendrils hanging down are the aerial roots of a parasitic fig reaching for water that isn't there anymore. Most big fish respond to falling water levels by escaping into the surrounding rivers when the lagoon dries out. Small fish have to survive in the pools that remain. These pike-like fish are characids. They're obviously predators, but what's the purpose of that orange spot on the end of their noses? Is it perhaps to attract their prey? So far, no one knows. Vultures are not usually seen over the lagoon. In the dry period, animals come out of the forest to feed on the fresh grass. Some die, some are killed by predators or forest Indians. Whatever the cause, the vultures soon appear to offer their disposal services. The corpse is a white-lipped peccary, South America's equivalent of a wild boar. 2 species of vulture gather on the kill, the yellow-headed and the far more aggressive black vulture. South American vultures are all able to locate food by smell. The yellowhead's sense of smell is particularly acute, but the black vulture, which seems to be wearing a black judge's wig, relies more on eyesight. The yellow-headed vulture and some other New World vultures usually live in much more densely wooded areas than their Old World counterparts. New World or Old World, vultures behave in much the same way everywhere. There's invariably a pecking order. In this case, it's the yellowheads who give way to the blacks, who then dispute the titbits amongst themselves. Throughout this argument, the yellowhead remains on the sidelines, looking as though it would like to join in, but not daring to. In one of the bigger pools left by the receding water, there are some mini predators. Just as the big fish escaped into the rivers, so did the big caiman. Caiman are South American alligators. These are spectacled caiman, said to be the fastest of all crocodilians in seizing their prey. Or in missing it. These small caiman would be far happier catching little fish, but they've probably eaten all the tiddlers left in the pool, so they're reduced to trying to catch dragon and damselflies. The margins of the drying pools attract forest butterflies. A swallowtail sticks its proboscis into the mud to suck up moisture. At first sight, it looks as though it's laying eggs. What it's really doing is getting rid of waste water. Towards the end of the drying out period, a bird with a beautiful name arrives to nest, the oropendula. Its proper name is the yellow-rumped cacique. They seem to be able to sense when the floods are likely to return. That's when they start nest building. Oropendulas are colonial nesters. They weave deep basket-shaped nests using palm fibers and aerial roots from the trees. The female does all the building. This one tied herself up in the threads and took some time to get free. At the top of the nest is a platform where the male displays. He's larger, gaudier, and more gorgeously golden. There are about 10 females in this colony and 2 males. The male watches the females weave and sings his nuptial song. The oropendulas have nested in a clump of spiny palms. The prickly trunks are a good defense against climbing predators. Soon the waters will return to make the palms even more impregnable. When the waters return, the Hoatzins will start nesting. The second journey to Quillabeno towards the beginning of the wet season was a nightmare. Friedemann Koester now had to bring in supplies for his most concentrated period of filming. The Hoatzin, the object of his quest, would soon be starting to nest. At this season, the rivers can drop 2 meters very quickly. Fallen trees block progress every few hundred meters. A journey of 15 kilometers as the crow flies, but not as the Amazon tributary flows, sometimes took 6 days. Victoriano Criollo, the chief of the Secoya Indians, kept a lookout in the bows. His son manned the outboard when it worked. Victoriano steered with a paddle from the bows, the only way to get round the bends. A raised arm meant fallen tree ahead, raise the outboard. If you're not quick enough, you can shear off the propeller. Often the stream was completely blocked by fallen trees. Then Victoriano took his axe and chopped his way through.
Hả? Đi gặp gì quả?
Sometimes logs could be hurdled with enough speed. Quite often the canoe stuck halfway. Secoya Indians have an answer for this. There's a tree in the forest called a Secoya. The underside of its bark is incredibly slippery. The Indians have inherited an encyclopedic knowledge of the forest and the benefits it has to offer. Though he has lived and worked as a scientist in South America much of his adult life, Friedemann had never seen Secoya bark used as a slipway before. The canoe with its load weighs at least half a ton. Once the bows rested on the bark, it slid across the log as if it had been greased. This one piece of bark repeated the performance half a dozen times without any sign of wear and tear. As they neared Cuiabeno Lagoon, the rivers shallowed. Eventually there was nothing for it but to get out and walk. It was only a few kilometers, but it was through the flooded forest, the Igapo itself. It took Friedemann 8 hours to hike to his camp while carrying nearly 40 kilos of film and food. To shift all the stores from this one canoe trip required 3 journeys, 24 hours of almost non-stop carrying. Ironically, soon after he was back in the lagoon, the water rose again. Violently changing levels are typical of late February and early March. This time the water was back to stay. In the spiny palms, the Oripendula colony was at last secure from attack from below, but not from above. Security vanished with the appearance of the black caracara. Caracaras are extremely bold members of the hawk family. They don't bother to hide themselves when they go raiding. This male Oropendula is busy displaying, but others give a warning call. The caracara isn't in the least deterred. However, the entrance to the nest is too small and well built for the raider to break in that way. The big bird might get stuck inside the deep pouch-shaped nest. So the caracara rips up the side. The Oropendulas try to drive it away. The defensive spines on the palm trunk are useless against this type of attack. A second caracara has arrived. There's only one egg. The normal clutch is 2 or 3, so she's only just started to lay. With the coming of the rains in mid-April, Friedemann knew he was reaching the final stages of his quest. Quillabeno Lagoon has risen 2 meters up the trunks of the spiny palms containing the Oropendula colony. The Hoatzins are now nesting in earnest. The Hoatzin is one of nature's oddities. It's a big bird about 60 centimeters long. The word that springs to mind when you first see one is primitive. It looks a little like a pheasant and a lot like the earliest known bird fossil, the Archaeopteryx. The permanently erect crest is a feature which is seen in few other birds. Rainfall and rising waters signal that it's nesting time for other forest species. One of the big Amazon woodpeckers, the lineated woodpecker, already has young in a macrolobium tree close by. On a branch near the water, there's a very different kind of nest. It's built largely of spiders' webs and is barely 2 centimeters wide. But it's big enough to contain the blue-tailed emerald hummingbird and its 2 chicks. She's returned to feed them with nectar gathered from flowering trees in the forest. Her beak is at least as long as the chick itself. It's like a sword-swallowing act. All those months of preparation and experiment have now paid off. To film the nesting Hoatzins, Friedemann has designed a fairly stable floating hide based on 2 canoes. The arrival of this strange contraption disturbs a white-breasted toucan. When Friedemann arrived to start filming the Hoatzins early each morning, he could never be certain whether his hide would be afloat in a meter of water or aground on the mud. Sometimes the water level rose or fell while he was actually filming.
As I was quick to learn, though, the flooded forest would be a very difficult job to tackle, including the filming of the Hoatzin, the bird I had come for. Working here as a scientist and wildlife cameraman requires two basic skills right away. You've got to know how to safely paddle a slender dugout, loaded with all your precious camera and sound equipment, and you must, of course, never get lost, neither on the way to your filming hide, nor, and that is even more vital, on your way back to camp. It is quite obvious that you can't even take a single foot of steady shots from a shaky canoe. So there is the problem of where and how to set up a stable hide for the filming in this flooded paradise. A mobile platform has obvious advantages, but it sure is heavy. And not even as a child, back in the forest at home, have I built so many platforms and trees as here.
Once Friedemann was in his hide, he had to stay there all day. Leaving it would disturb the Hoatzin. With temperatures often in the mid-30s centigrade, he became very dehydrated. But if he drank a lot, he would also sweat a lot and mist up the eyepiece of the camera. On a good day, he shot less than 3 minutes of film. Rather than risk missing anything because of a fogged viewfinder, he waited to drink until he had climbed out of his sweatbox each evening. When the water was the right level, he looked directly into a Hoatzin nest with 2 eggs. The nest is a fairly flimsy affair, and with good reason. Rainforests are subjected to constant downpours. If the nest was more solid, it would fill up with water. There are usually 2 or 3 eggs. Incubation takes about a month. From the beginning, the chicks are fed on food pre-digested by the parents. It's probably the most glamorous food in the world. For the Queer-Beno Hoatzins, it consists largely of orchids. They normally feed only on the leaves, buds and fruit of just 3 or 4 species of riverside trees. But here orchids form a large part of their diet. To the orchids is added a sprinkling of epiphytes. And some leaves. In most birds, the upper bill is fixed to the skull. In the Hoatzin, it's articulated, a characteristic it shares with parrots. This probably helps the bird to bite off large sections of tough leaves. The Hoatzin has a highly specialized crop. In most other birds, the crop is simply a storage sac. But the Hoatzin acts like a gizzard, grinding up the food which it feeds to its young as a green soup. Nearby, the hummingbird's chicks are now nearly overflowing their tiny nest. Parent and chicks together weigh less than 15 grams. When a Hoatzin raises its wings, it's excited or disturbed. In this case, the anxiety is almost certainly because the chick is making its first expedition away from the nest. Hoatzin young clamber around in the branches when they're a little over a week old. The parent clucks to reassure it. This early adventure is not quite as dangerous as it seems. Hoatzin young have very unusual climbing equipment. Now we're coming to the connection with the earliest bird of all, the Archaeopteryx, the fossil link between birds and reptiles. On each wing, the Hoatzin young have 2 claws. A few other bird species have wing claws, but the Hoatzin is the only one that uses them for clinging and climbing. The claws are a great advantage to a chick that spends its early days over water. Because of these claws, it's tempting to view the Hoatzin as a missing link. But many other characteristics of the adult are far from primitive. It's even been suggested that the chick's wing claws are the product of recent evolution rather than a relic of the past. So far, no one is certain. The Hoatzin remains an intriguing mystery. Amid a great deal of parental excitement, the young bird is eventually persuaded to return to the nest. Although Quillabeno is a nature reserve, the government of Ecuador protects the rights of the forest Indians in whose territory the lagoons lie. Hunting and fishing are among those rights. The forest Indians seldom hunt adult Hoatzin. They say it doesn't taste good, but they sometimes take its eggs as a delicacy. They only collect a reasonable harvest. Conserving a species for future use is a practical philosophy which all hunting peoples understand. Though the Indians didn't understand why Friedemann wanted to film the birds, they always cooperated by keeping away from the nest on which he had set up his hide. The egg collector, a Secoya Indian, and his son are relatives of the old chief who taught Friedemann how to use the slippery bark to free his canoe. The parent bird has already been scared off, but there's a 10-day-old chick in the nest. The young bird demonstrates one of the Hoatzin's most remarkable survival tactics. Hoatzin chicks can swim from a few days old. They can escape most predators by diving and hiding amongst waterweed and sunken roots which their plumage closely resembles. But they've got to be able to clamber back into the nest trees so that their parents can feed them. That's where the wing claws again come in useful. The young Hoatzin is perfectly adapted to survival in the flooded forest. But can the flooded forest itself survive? At present, little seems to threaten the peace and serenity of Cuiabano. Whatever its mood, it is one of the most tranquil and unspoiled places in the whole of South America. There is, however, one threat, and that comes from deep in the earth. Burning waste gas from an oil well. There's a lot of oil beneath the flooded forest, and Ecuador needs the revenue. It's fair to say that both the government and the oil company are doing everything in their power to avoid harming the environment. The oil installations themselves are small and unobtrusive, but there is always the threat of pollution, of oil seeping into the rivers whose waters supply Cuiabano, the magical lagoon where at present the Hoatzin nest undisturbed.